Welcome to the Doctor Journal Club podcast, the show that goes under the hood of evidence-based integrative medicine. We review recent research articles, interview evidence-based medicine thought leaders, and discuss the challenges and opportunities of integrating evidence-based and integrative medicine. Continue your learning after the show at www.drjournalclub.com.
Please bear in mind that this is for educational and entertainment purposes only. Talk to your doctor before making any medical decisions, changes, etc. Everything we're talking about, that's to teach you guys stuff and have fun. We are not your doctors. Also, we would love to answer your specific questions. On drjournalclub.com, you can post questions and comments for specific videos, but go ahead and email us directly at josh@drjournalclub.com. That's josh@drjournalclub.com. Send us your listener questions, and we will discuss it on our pod. All right. Welcome back, everybody. Apologies. It has been a while since we've had a recording. This is mostly / all my fault. I had a bunch of grants due and exams and dissertations and all this jazz and just kind of took a break for a bit. But separation makes the heart grow fonder, and I missed y'all. Adam, I missed you too. How are you doing?
I'm doing well. I missed you too, Josh. Yeah, it's been a while, and we were like, hey, we have to get back on the podcast. We can't let this slip. So
I was getting used to my Thursday mornings again, and then I was like, oh man, this would be. I like the conversations that we have, and I feel like we get some good debates going, and I like when there's listener questions too. And today, actually, that's going to be a little bit of a departure for us. So I like chatting about methods, and Adam's like, dude, that's boring. Nobody wants to hear that. And I'm like, oh, liar. All of our listeners love that kind of stuff. He's like, no, they're clinicians. They want to hear clinically relevant stuff. And I guess that makes some minute level of rational sense. So we're trying to keep it more clinically relevant. And we had a listener, SSL, the amazing SSL, Dr. Steven Sandberg Lewis. You probably had him as a professor, right?
I did. So for a little bit of background, he was actually an influence as to why I chose the ND path. I was dealing with some, I was dealing with some like GI functional kind of issues, and learned about him through a couple like webinars while I was in undergrad, and he was one of the few who was just like kind of looking into the root cause of stuff. And I was like, no one's really even asked like, why is this happening? Kind of approach to medicine, at least at the time, and what I was looking into and being exposed to, and so that kind of helped with my trajectory. And he was my instructor during my GI block.
I didn't know that, or everyone's got this cool origin to naturopathic medicine story. That's cool. I didn't know that. I don't know if does he know that? He will now.
Yeah.
I know him from GI work. So my clinical background's in naturopathic gastroenterology, and I remember the first conference I went to where he was speaking, and he's like this bigwig, right? He's like the grandfather of naturopathic gastroenterology, and he gets up and talks, and then he's like in the middle of the talk, he's like, I'm just gonna take a break here for a second. He goes over to the side, picks up a guitar, it starts playing guitar in the middle of his talk, and I don't even remember what it was about, but it was some song about the GI tract, and it probably involved like some crazy mechanisms and gut-brain connections. Anyway, we'll have to see if he can send us a MP4. We can upload it to that.
He also has a time machine. He does not age.
I know. He's been in practice for like 40 years. I'm like, really?
He looks like he's still like 20.
I know. And we're not just saying that to get on your good side, Dr. SSL. Okay, because we've already graduated. You've already passed us.
I was on his shift as a student.
Oh, so, really? Nice.
Yeah, so I don't need at this point, I don't need like a letter of recommendation or anything.
Yeah, you already got it. You're good. So he sent me, so he's a listener, because all clever, intelligent humans are, of our show. And he found an interesting study. And he's like, hey, these two nerds like talking about research. Maybe they can help me make sense of this paper. And so I said, yeah, no problem. Let's talk about it on the show. And this is one of the things that, Adam, you wanted to do more and more, where we kind of give examples of how we might break down a research study to help kind of model that, but also you can learn clinically like what the clinical take homes are as well. So sort of like 2 in 1. So do you want to set up the like what the study's about, the authors and things? We'll do links in the show notes, of course, and then we can jump into, you know, the things you look for in a study, what you thought was interesting about this one, et cetera.
Yeah, and then also, you know, the thing I like about this paper too is we can get into some of that methodology, because there were some interesting methods here that I do think we need to address. And it was just an interesting paper from both a clinical and methodological standpoint. So I think we get best of both worlds.
Yeah,
so
cool.
Shout out to Dr. SSL for finding this paper.
Yeah, props, man. Appreciate it. So it's a new study, came out 2023.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it was based out in China, but they used data from the United Kingdom Biobank, which is a gigantic repository of data that uses essentially a huge cohort study of over 500,000 people that has data on various, you know, genetic, what we call SNPs, single nucleotide, I think
polymorphisms.
Yeah. And the whole point of that biobank is to essentially look at sort of genetic relationships to a variety of diseases, and then, you know, we can do a bunch of studies based off of that and see how genes, in addition to different exposures or risk factors, influence you know, disease processes or disease outcomes. So in this example, we're going to be looking at the association of laxative use with incident dementia and modifying the effect of genetics susceptibility. So incidence, meaning the new diagnosis or new onset, and incidence is different from prevalence. Prevalence is all of the existing cases, whereas incidence is all of the new cases. And so what they did in this study, the purpose was to investigate the association of laxative use with 3 things. Really, it was 4. They did add on 1 thing. So if you just kind of skim through it, you may have only seen 3, but it was actually 4. So 1 is the association of laxative use with incident dementia, meaning is there an association between using laxatives and a new diagnosis of dementia? Another aim was the laxative type in incident dementia. So is there an association between the type of laxative used and a new diagnosis of dementia? And for those who don't know, we have different subclasses of laxatives. So we have osmotic laxatives. That would be something like magnesium, where if you drink a bunch of magnesium for whatever reason, some people like to use it for, let's say, muscle cramps or to help them sleep at night. If you take too much, the next day you may have some diarrhea, and the reason is because the magnesium pulls water into the lumen of the stomach, and then that flushes things out.
That's like my favorite go-to constipation approach, actually, clinically.
Well, let's see if it is after this study.
Yeah, well, we'll get into that, but yeah.
We've got stimulant laxatives, so this is something like a senna. You drink it, and it just takes you on for a nice ride. You got secretory laxatives, so that's again something that's similar to like a lactulose. You may see that. That kind of just, again, if you think about the word secretory, just kind of secreting things out. You have your bulk forming laxatives, so think fiber. You have stool softeners, and then you have emollients. So those are your main laxative types. So they did a good job of not only saying, hey, do laxatives have an association, but do specific subtype of laxatives as a class have an association. Mm-hmm. And then they also looked at quantifying the combined association of laxative use and a person's genetic predisposition with dementia. So that was really cool, because they're saying not only is there an association between the laxative use and dementia, mm-hmm. And so the way you kind of break this down is like, okay, in scenario A, we say, is there an association between these different genetic single nucleotide polymorphisms and dementia? Mm-hmm. In part B, is there an association between laxative use and dementia? Mm-hmm. And now let's combine them. Is there an association for people who are at some sort of a risk for genetic predisposition to dementia that is increased when we add on laxative use? And then does that increase the risk for dementia?
Yeah, it's like an additive effect, so that they're like working mm-hmm. in a bad way together.
Yeah. And then they also wanted to see, does the dose matter? So is there an association between the dose of a laxative and incident dementia? And so I think that you know, that the way that they kind of teased this apart and looked at different ways of making this association are logical, and I like the stepped approach that they did with it. And one thing that we also have to recognize too is, just for some background context, is there does seem to be a pretty large interest in this, you know, the gut-brain connection,
right,
where people who have dementia tend to also have high rates of constipation. And so, you know, one association out there is like, if for people who have chronic constipation, are they at risk for the development of dementia? And if they are, if we treat the constipation and get them going on a regular basis, can we potentially reduce the risk of developing dementia?
That's important because that wasn't initially clear. I think if you're not in the gut space or comfortable with that, be like, well, why would laxatives cause dementia? That's not what they're saying. They're saying we have this association with constipation and dementia, and what happens if we treat that constipation?
Yeah. And then we also have to, you know, recognize, how are we defining dementia? Because there's so many different types of dementia. You can't just say, I have dementia, right? There's a whole variety of dementia. There's Alzheimer's disease, there's vascular dementia, there's, you know, frontotemporal dementia, et cetera, et cetera. So the three definitions that they used was, one was basically, you can think of it like as a composite, so all cause dementia. Then they also looked at Alzheimer's disease, and then they also looked at vascular dementia.
Right.
And one thing that we also have to kind of take into consideration, which is, you know, when you're using this kind of, doing this kind of a study, you just, from a not plausibility, from a logistical standpoint, you're not going to be able to do dementia takes a long time to develop, right? It's not like you can do a 14-week trial and say, oh yeah, we've reduced the risk of dementia. Like, you're not going to be able to do that, because it's such a slow growing disease process, if you will. It's going to be almost impossible to get a, let's say, 30-year randomized controlled trial to see if anything happens. One, that's going to be very costly, and just logistically is impossible to do. So the best thing that we have are these cohort studies. And so this was a retrospective cohort study, meaning they had the data and they just went back and then kind of went forward with the data to look at the outcome, which is dementia.
Right. So you've got these, so the UK Biobank, like you said, so you've got these cohorts throughout the world where they just study the heck out of these group of people, and they watch them like hawks for decades. And then you as a researcher can get access to that and ask any question you want and go back to the beginning of the study and say, okay, with these questions, what happens after 20, 30 years? Because we already have that information. And the cool thing about the UK Biobank, like you said, is they have genetic data. So if you're interested in SNPs, you can get that information too. You sat down with nurses and told them what medications you were on, what medical issues you had. It's linked to the healthcare system. So for all these reasons, you know, these researchers could go in with their question about laxatives and dementia and say, you know, we could figure out from this cohort who got what after how much time and what medications they were taking. And anyone could go in and do that. So the cohort was done, you know, prospectively, that was what the cohort was, but you then go back retrospectively and ask your question. So that's what these researchers did.
Yeah. And the issue with that is there's quite a bit of bias in these kind of study designs, because, and we'll get into this in a little bit, is, you know, you don't really have the randomization process. There's a lot of confounders that you can't really take into consideration because you have that lack of randomization. And there's just, from a study standpoint, it's just not as rigorous as a randomized controlled trial. But for the question at hand and the amount of data that we need, it's kind of sort of the best that we can get at this time. And so any sort of results you do have to take with quite a large grain of salt, but also recognize that we don't really have another option at the current moment.
Yeah, and they take care to address the randomization issue. So, and we've got a video on this on Dr. Journal Club. We'll link to it on propensity scoring. But essentially, you know, the magic of randomization, ideally, is that you basically balance out the two groups with any prognostic factors. So things that would lead you to get dementia in the first place, whether it's genetic predisposition or you got a TBI, you got hit on the head or something like that, or in decades previous. So all those things, if the groups are divided randomly, should be spread out equally. So the only difference in theory is caused by the thing that you're measuring. So so in an observational cohort like this, you can't randomize. So how do you do that? So there's different tricks. And one of them is propensity scoring, which is propensity score matching, I guess, which is what they did here. Did you want to speak about that one a little bit, or?
Yeah, I can do it, but I'll probably butcher it, and you can kind of come in and rescue me. But basically, when it comes to propensity score matching, what you're basically trying to do is like a pseudo randomization, but within a cohort, as opposed to randomized controlled trial, like you were saying. So really, they're trying to match participants as closely as possible and try to limit the amount of confounding that's going on. And so they're trying to match, let's say, individual A, who is exposed to the risk or whatever exposure you're measuring, and trying to match them as closely as possible to some sort of control person B who isn't being exposed or have some sort of a risk factor for that outcome that you're interested in. And so you're trying to match them up as closely as possible and basically create a score based off of that. And so let's say your score is 4, and you get someone else who matches as a 4.1. Well, then maybe those two are as kind of like, okay, we'll compare these two together. And then you just repeat that process for thousands and thousands and thousands of people. And theoretically, you kind of come up with two groups that are extremely similar, as best as possible without the actual randomization process.
Yeah, that's exactly it. And essentially, you pick all the things. So if we think this through, just because I want to underline this, because I think this is important. This is the major difference between randomized trials and observational studies, and how we address that. Because your point earlier was sometimes we just can't do the randomized trial. This is a great example, right? Like 2% of people in this time period would develop dementia. You need decades and decades of time. I mean, it would just, first of all, be maybe unethical. Also, it would cost like billions of dollars to run that study, right? So you just can't do it. This is the only way to get that data. So so you look at all the different things. So if you think about it, if someone is going to take a laxative, right, and you want to say, does that laxative cause an issue in this case? So the exposure's the laxative, the outcome is dementia. The issue is the people that are going to take laxatives may look very different than the people who aren't going to take laxatives, right? And you want to make sure that that difference isn't explaining the dementia to begin with, right? So with this, like you said, you build these scores and then you basically match them. So everything that would have led you to get that laxative, right? All the propensity to get that laxative is matched. But the other group just didn't happen to get the laxative, but the propensity for it was the same. And that's what you're looking at. And then again, the only difference you're really measuring there is the exposure, which is laxative. Perfect. So, okay. So go ahead.
And I was just going to add to that of the things that they adjusted for in this study between the two groups, I thought was also very relevant because they kind of adjusted for a lot of the things that we already know can contribute to dementia. So they adjusted for sex, age, ethnicity, socioeconomic levels, education, employment status, smoking status, alcohol use, physical activity level, quality of the diet. So they basically had a way of categorizing the diet as unhealthy, and healthy, basically, depending on how they answered food frequency questionnaires, looking at things of like, okay, what's their red meat consumption, fruit, veggie consumption, saturated fat consumption, et cetera, et cetera. BMI, heart disease status, if they've had a stroke, which makes sense because that would be a huge risk factor for vascular dementia, hypertension, diabetes, depression, constipation, and their cholesterol level.
Yeah. So it's great. I mean, so you get this big bucket of patients or participants that look identical on all the important factors that we can think of anyway. And then you measure it later and you make sure that, they're indistinguishable, the two groups. So you have these perfectly balanced groups, and really that only difference is laxative. So, and the other cool thing is when you do this, you can do, like they did 3-to-1. So for every case of someone that had a laxative, they had 3 people that looked just like that person on all the relevant factors, but didn't take a laxative. And because it's a 3-to-1 ratio now, your precision is so much better. So you can A, see an effect easier, and B, have a very precise estimate around that effect because there's less variability at play because there's more people. Even though you only have a handful of actual, cases, you can maximize your precision by increasing the number of controls. So that's sort of a benefit there. So when you look at this study and you get to the method section and they talk about, 3-to-1 propensity score matching, that's what this is talking about. So all that weird statistics talk about all that. That's what we're essentially been talking about here. Okay, so
and then before we get into it even more, what did you think about the fact that they thought it was considered sufficient if the covariates only differed by less than 10%, meaning, between the two groups that there was less than a 10% difference in whatever that variable they were measuring was. So let's say, there was there were 5% who were unemployed in the control group, but 10% who were unemployed in the exposure group. That would be less than 5% difference there in those two covariates. So they thought anything less than 10% was adequate. Did you think that was a bit high, or were you okay with that?
I guess I was okay with that. And another thing to point out is, if you have some questions about, was this, okay, it wasn't randomized, maybe we have issues with these differences between the groups. One mitigating factor there is to look at, if there was an effect, the effect size, right? So if you do have some concerns about maybe groups and there's a small effect size, you can say, well, maybe that was this difference between baseline groups, something like that. But conversely, if you have a very large effect size, like, so for example, with grade, not to bring it back to grade every time, but I will, with grade, you can rank up observational quality of evidence based on effect size because it overcomes a lot of these concerns that we think, okay, maybe the effect isn't as large as they said, but it's probably real. So that's another thing to bear in mind as well.
And one thing I do also want to talk about is how they ascertained dementia and laxative use. So how did they determine if people had dementia and quantify their laxative use? Because I do think that is a big influencing thing, because not everybody knows how much laxative they're taking. So if we're looking at doses, that's important. So laxative use ascertainment, basically they just asked the participant, do you use a laxative?
Right.
And it was a yes or no. And then they also looked at any sort of medications that were like in their medical charts.
Right.
And essentially used that as an ascertainment method. So, you have to take that with a grain of salt, because you're not rigorously saying, okay, if you take Miralax daily, 1 cap a day, does that result in dementia? That's kind of the clinical question that we can't really answer. We can, if we do have an association, it's going to be kind of a loose association because we don't know the exact doses that people were on. And then if you were to ask basically anybody at any point in time, do you use a laxative? They're going to probably say yes, because I'm sure everyone's been constipated at least once in their life, right? Maybe not, but you get the point. And then also when it comes to dementia ascertainment, again, they relied on self-report, which is kind of, which is iffy because you have dementia. And then also they looked at hospital admission, death records, and basically the UK variant of an ICD-10 code. And those are also flawed because oftentimes in medicine, as clinicians, we're not getting the correct diagnosis, or we're not putting in the true ICD-10 code that best matches the participant. Oftentimes, we're just throwing in an ICD-10 code because we don't want to document our entire life away, and it gets the job done just to put in, let's say, diabetes as opposed to diabetes with all these other components to the ICD-10 code. And so they're not 100% accurate. They're not being independently confirmed by, let's say, a neurologist who specializes in geriatrics and does, only focuses on, cognitive decline and dementia, and that's all they do, and have the actual, gold standard method of doing a diagnosis. So we are kind of loosely diagnosing these people with dementia. So we do need to keep that in mind.
Okay, well let's actually, that's a really interesting point. So let's play with that a bit, because one thing I really want our listeners to start doing is, it's step one, I think, is to know what to look for. Step two is to like identify things like you're identifying and say, there might be some issues, measurement issues here, some concerns here. But I think the next step is to play out in your mind like what effect that would have, and in what direction, and what magnitude. And so, for example, let's look at the dementia outcome here. So you listed a lot of concerns for dementia as far as how it's measured. So first of all, I might counter that for a diagnosis like dementia, I feel like that formal diagnosis is going to be made most likely by a neurologist, right? So if you have a primary care doc and they've got some concerns, maybe they're making a diagnosis of like cognitive-ish complaints or things like that, memory issues. Are they making the dementia call themselves? Maybe yes, maybe no. Most likely, I feel like if that's in their charts, that probably had a formal workup. Most likely, though, what you're suggesting is it's underreported, right? So people aren't reporting the dementia, and so you're missing cases. So my question for you is, what if we're measuring primarily here like risk ratios and the difference between Group A and Group B, what concern do you have there? Are you feeling like it's going to be diagnosed differently in Group A versus Group B? Is it going to have a qualitative difference, quantitative difference? If so, on absolute levels, on relative levels, what outcome, what statistic are you most concerned about when it comes to measuring that outcome?
That's actually a very fair point that I didn't really think about, to be honest, because you would think that if it's being underreported and you're having a large effect or a large association, then that would only add to the robustness of the results.
Right? So it makes the results stronger, not weaker. Yeah.
Yeah.
And then also, remember, these groups are balanced. And if we're measuring dementia cases, if there is a bias, like an undercounting of dementia, theoretically, it would be the same in both groups. So if you're looking at the relative difference, like you're 2 times as likely or 4 times as likely or half as likely, there will be no difference. It doesn't matter if it's undercounted. You're looking at the relative difference between groups. Now, if you're actually interested in the absolute effect, like is it 6% versus 3%? Yeah, those numbers I think might be off. The prevalence numbers, the incidence numbers might be off, to your point. But primarily, they're reporting relative numbers, and so I'm less concerned about the relative numbers. And also, I think, if anything, like you said, it would be an undercount. But I think I'm more concerned about your point about the laxatives, because I think that will, let's play that out a little bit, because that would impact results a bit. So you're suggesting people may underreport laxative use. It's over the counter a lot of the time, almost all the time. They may not think of it as a medicine when they're being asked. It may not be in their chart. So on the one hand, you might say, well, then if the non-laxative group was actually taking laxatives, then
well, would that draw towards the null?
It would draw it towards the null. And so you're seeing a large effect. And therefore, just like before, if we see an effect, it would be even stronger, because if there's a bias, it's drawing it towards the null. However, you could counter and say, well, everyone else who remembers their laxative, maybe they remember their laxative because their constipation is way worse than someone who has mild constipation and doesn't even think about taking it. Maybe that's a thing. I'm not sure. But if you're measuring the laxative as a way of basically measuring constipation, which I think they are in this study, then I'm not so worried about it, because if they remember it enough because it's an issue, then that's an issue.
Right.
So cool. This is good. This is a good exercise. So again, step 1 is know what to look for. Step 2, like think about potential issues like measurement bias, like Adam's talking about, but then think about how that would play out. Does that make you have more faith in the results or less faith in the results? And it sounds like at this point, both of us are comfortable that would actually give us more faith in the results. Great point.
And then the last thing from a method standpoint, and then we'll get into the actual results and what everyone's waiting for.
Look at you talking about methods the whole time. I love it. Go ahead.
No, I know, but it's important. the way that they determine the polygenic risk score, so are you at low, moderate, or high risk of dementia?
Yeah.
They actually looked at 29 different SNPs. So if you think about it, like bits of DNA that are associated with dementia, and then gave a weighted average, if you will, of how those are, the magnitude of relationship to dementia based on prior data from genome-wide associated studies. And then basically those who have a higher score are at higher risk for dementia, those who have a lower score are at lower risk for dementia, et cetera, et cetera. And so then they just categorize people as low, medium, and high risk based on specific cutoff scores.
Yeah, and I had a little bit of a picadillo with that. So it sounded, maybe it was just a reporting issue, but it sounded like they just added up whatever the literature said. Okay, this SNP gives you a 5% risk. This SNP gives you a 2% risk. If you add them together, it's 7% risk. I don't know that we can say that they're independent risk factors. Like in other words, if you add A and B, is it really 7 or is it really 6? And so I'm not sure about that. And I don't know that all those studies that they're adding up prove that this is the risk independent of all other dementia risks. But it's a mooted point because they put them in broad buckets of, like you said, mild, moderate, or high risk. So I'm probably fine with that. But I was there were some reporting issues. There was some language issues. Like I feel like they needed a copy editor. I'm not sure. The science looked good, but I was like, how does the journal not at least give them a freaking copy editor, right? Like how much does that cost? Anyway, but yeah, let's jump into the results.
Yes. Okay. So the entire UK Biobank is like a little over 500,000 people, but in this study they had data from 487,000 using round numbers here just for ease. The mean average, so the average age of participants was 56 and a half, which is actually kind of young if you think about dementia,
right?
Which I thought was kind of interesting. And then just under half were male participants, 46%. Of those 487,000, only 3% used laxatives. So that was about 14,500.
That was surprising.
And then also here's a good example as to like why relative risk and risk ratios would be better than absolute risk, is because the incidence was actually really low.
Yeah.
Only 1.5% of total participants developed dementia. So that was just a little over 7,000. Just over half of a percent of people developed Alzheimer's, 0.6%, or 3,074 in absolute terms. And then vascular dementia was 0.3% incidence for just a little bit over 1,600 participants. And the use of laxatives was more common in elderly women who smoked, drank excessively, were physically inactive, had an unhealthier diet, lower socioeconomic status, lower education level, and more comorbidities, including heart disease, stroke, high blood pressure, hypertension, and depression. So all of those clearly influence dementia, or we know are associated with dementia, and to kind of see that happening was kind of consistent with what we see,
and underlies the point of the importance of propensity scoring, right? And so that those are like, yeah, it would make sense that you would have people that have constipation are more likely to have a crummy diet and more likely to be inactive. Those are in and of themselves are risk factors for dementia. Oh, wait, we controlled for that. We've got people that look like that for each participant on the other side. But yeah.
Yeah. And so after propensity score matching, they had just under 14,500 people who were considered as laxative users, and just over 43,000 were matched as non-laxative users. So we went from 500,000 to 487 to now just like at around close to 70,000 participant data, if you will, for this entire study. And they said that no major imbalances in covariates differed by more than 10%. Mm-hmm. So we can be pretty confident here that the propensity score matching worked, quote unquote, if you will, in the sense of like, hey, these people at baseline are essentially identical for everything that we've controlled and as best we could without it being an actual randomized controlled trial.
Yeah, I would agree with that. I'm comfortable with the balanced groups.
Okay, so after following them for 15 years, of the participants, there were 1,400 new cases of dementia, of which 2% were non-laxative users and 3.5% were laxative users. And then when they looked at the association of just the genetic risk for dementia, compared to individuals who had low genetic susceptibility, individuals who are at mild or moderate level of susceptibility to dementia, the risk ratio there was 1.29, so 29% increased risk of dementia compared to those who are at low genetic risk. And then when we compare high to low, it was 2.76, so a 176% increase in the risk of dementia through genetics alone, and those were both statistically significant.
Right. So that's kind of like a no duh. They're like, well, we're going to take all the if you have genetic risk for dementia, and then we're going to see if they had a higher rate of dementia, and they did. So that reinforces their buckets, right? So that's more confidence that we can have in their bucket approach.
And then when they just looked at the general idea of, okay, so we know that there's an association of genetic susceptibility and dementia, and we're also seeing a greater magnitude when you have a higher genetic susceptibility. That makes sense. That checks out. So that's part A. So now let's do part B independently. Is there even an association of laxative use and dementia? And they did find an association. Compared to non-users, the hazard ratio was 1.71 with a confidence interval of 1.54 to 1.92. So, 71% increased risk for dementia on a relative basis.
Yeah, and so just for listeners' sake, so a hazard ratio above 1 means it increased risk, right? And so you said it was 1.7. What was it? 1.72.
1.71. Yeah.
1.71. So that's 70, like you said, 71%, because that's how much more above 1 it is. But what else can you infer from that confidence interval? Say that confidence interval again, and what could the readers infer from that?
So the confidence interval was 1.54 to 1.92. So one way to look at it is like on average, 71% increased risk, but the true estimate lies anywhere from 54% to 92%. And because it hasn't crossed 1, meaning if it went from like, let's say, negative 1.54 to positive 1.92, it's crossed the insignificant threshold. So we're still maintaining that statistical significance. Not that statistical significance necessarily, matters, if you will. You don't want to get too lost in the p-values, but that confidence interval is relatively narrow, I would say. So we're pretty, precise with our estimates here.
Yeah.
And that also reflects the huge, number of participants. If that went from like 1.54 to 22.3, we'd be like, this is such a huge range in the truthfulness, basically, or the precision of our estimate that I don't know if I can trust that. But when it's between, when your actual average is really like in the middle of that confidence interval, you become a lot more confident in that estimate. So it's much more precise.
Yep. No, I think that's great. So that's excellent. So we're definitely seeing this increased risk. It is statistically significant, like we said. That's not the be all end all, but even the range of confidence is still quite high. So okay, so we take laxatives. We have a higher risk we're more likely to have dementia. Okay, what else do we know?
We also know, so remember, that's all-cause dementia, if you will. So all dementia as a whole. So now when we look into things like Alzheimer's disease and vascular dementia, we also see that there's an increased risk with use of laxative compared to non-users. And that magnitude of effect was slightly attenuated, meaning went down just a little bit to 1.36 with a confidence interval of 0.13 to 1.63. So 36% increased risk with a range of 13 to 63%.
Yeah, so we're seeing this rise across the board. Let's talk about the difference in the type of laxative effect and what sense, if any, you make from that.
Sure. And then also just to round out the discussion, the association of the laxative with vascular dementia was also essentially the same. hazard ratio of 1.53 with a confidence interval of 1.23 to 1.92. So we're seeing similar results there. Okay, now when we're looking at the different type of laxatives, only the bulk forming laxatives were not associated with dementia, which I thought is kind of interesting because if we're thinking about like fiber supplementation and fiber as a whole, and then that gut brain connection, we know that fiber is going to be feeding like gut microbiota. And, if we have one thing that you could think about or theorize is like, hey, if we have good microbiota, or maybe there's specific strains that are associated with increased or decreased risk of dementia, the fiber could be feeding those good and or bad bugs, quote unquote, and having some sort of an effect there. So something that would require further investigation, but something that is pretty interesting. However,
so let's underline that because I think that's key. So you're suggesting, which is not what the authors are suggesting, you're suggesting that the fiber does not have an association with dementia, whereas the other types do, because there may be some beneficial protective effects of the fiber. So people with constipation, let me just play out the rationale. So people with constipation are more likely to have dementia, and there may be some causal relationship there. And so if you treat the constipation, does dementia improve? It doesn't seem that way. Most laxatives that people are taking for their constipation, we're still seeing that dementia. So there goes that theory, except that fiber laxatives are no longer seeing an association with dementia. And you're suggesting that's because that fiber may be beneficial for the microbiome?
I'm not suggesting it. I'm throwing it out there as something that needs to be investigated further. And just like if we think about some of the research that's out there looking at dementia and sort of our gut-brain axis is just something to look into. Yeah. I don't want people running away with it saying, oh, that's the reason why, because we can't say that based on this data, and I don't know the background data on that sort of theory.
Yeah, no, absolutely. So all the caveats about clinical interpretation, but I think that's a fascinating theory, and it's not the way the authors looked at that data point. They looked at it as a severity surrogate in that, which is very interesting, because if you think about constipation, the first thing, myself included, docs are going to recommend is bulk forming laxatives first. Oh, that doesn't work. Your constipation's so severe. Now try osmotics. Oh, you're downing grams of magnesium. It's not doing anything. Okay, now let's get the Senna and have that fun story. And then let's do the prescriptions after that. And so really it may be a surrogate for severity of constipation with the bulk forming laxatives. If people are still taking that when they were measured, AKA their constipation's less severe, AKA they have a lower risk of having dementia if there's that causal relationship there. So this is a good point in that the problem with observational studies is you can't prove causation. You're just looking at associations, and we don't know what directionality this is or the reason for, or if it's just coincidental. And this is exactly the point, is that we're sitting here scratching our heads. Okay, you look at the numbers, you see an association. Is that because laxatives are causing dementia? Is that because people with constipation, the constipation is causing dementia? Is that because dementia is causing constipation? Is that because there's a commonality that's causing both? Is it unrelated? If it is related, what is doing what? Is the reason we're not seeing it with bulk forming because it's lower severity, or because it's feeding the microbiome? These are all questions we can't answer with this study design, but it's absolutely fascinating. It's a good case example of we have to be very careful with our causal statements around observational studies.
Yeah. And then just because of from a time standpoint, and I do want to get into some other stuff too, stool softeners, stimulant laxatives, and osmotic laxatives were all essentially doubled the risk for dementia, with stool softeners having a hazard ratio of 1.96, stimulant laxatives having a hazard ratio of 1.80, and osmotic laxatives having the highest at 2.07. And the confidence intervals on all of those basically ranged from a 1.2 to a 3. None of them were associated with Alzheimer's disease, and only osmotic laxatives were associated with vascular dementia with a hazard ratio of 2.34. And that confidence interval went from a 1.3 to a 4.3. And then something that they also mentioned was that senna, lactulose, and docusate were also associated with dementia. I don't necessarily know why they called those out in particular, as opposed to just kind of keeping everything within the class that they were talking about. But I thought that that was interesting as well. Mm-hmm. And then for sort of like the grand finale, when we look at, so we broke it up of, okay, is there genetic susceptibility? We said yes. Mm-hmm. Is there an association of laxative use and dementia? We said yes. Mm-hmm. Is there an association with type of laxative use and type of dementia or dementia in general? Yes and no, you know, kind of, there's some nuance there. Now for the grand finale, we say, okay, what is the risk of combining the laxative and our genetic susceptibility? Because we would expect that if we have a high genetic susceptibility and we add on a laxative, then our risk would be even greater than if we had a low risk and, you know, use the laxative or, kind of just build off on that theory. So what they showed was that for those with low to, you know, moderate genetic susceptibility plus the use of a laxative, the hazard ratio there was 1.86 with a confidence interval of 1.58 to 2.2. So basically close to double the risk with a fairly wide confidence interval, but not terrible to suggest that there's increased risk there. However, for those with a high genetic susceptibility plus the use of laxatives, that hazard ratio jumped up to a 4.1 with a much more precise confidence interval of a 3.5 to a 4.8. So we are seeing some pretty loud noise there to suggest that there may be something going on. Mm-hmm. And then when they actually looked at another analysis to look at, you know, okay, what is that interaction between the laxative use and genetic susceptibility? The laxative use explained about 18% of that increased risk, but there didn't seem to be an association there with Alzheimer's disease and vascular dementia, more so just with all-cause dementia.
Cool. So I guess the final question is like, what's the take home? And I had a challenge understanding what their hypothesis really was. I think my understanding is they're like, hey, constipation is associated with dementia. If you treat the constipation, does dementia get better? They're not asking if laxatives cause dementia. That's not the question, right? The question is, if you treat this constipation with laxatives, do we see a lower or null risk of dementia, right? I guess that was the theory. And their concluding statement at the end there is, the findings suggested that the use of laxatives could not reduce the risk of dementia through treating constipation, which I think is relatively fair statement based on their findings. But
well, I think it's also kind of interesting because the title of the study kind of makes you think, okay, are they just looking at the association between laxative use and dementia?
Yeah, that's what I was like.
I was spun it around and kind of twisted it to be like, well, actually, if we're trying to treat constipation,
right,
it's more likely the constipation has some sort of relationship, and treating that may not be associated with it. But I felt kind of like the opposite of maybe the question was, is there an association?
I think it was poorly written. I had the same question. The whole time I was reading it, I was like, well, what would be the mechanism of these disparate forms of laxatives causing disparate dementias? That doesn't make any sense. Mm-hmm. And then I was like, oh, it's just treating the constipation is their theory. And then it kind of clicked in. But yeah, I agree. I don't think they were very clear in their writing. But it's a good exercise in that, these observational studies can't really prove one way or another. It's just looking at associations, and you have to tease out what makes sense as far as the causes.
Yeah. And I mean, I think we also have to take into consideration too, okay, let's wrap it up from like a clinical standpoint. Is there an association? We do see that there's an association, mm-hmm. but it's one of those things where association and causation can't be implemented. Mm-hmm. I think the wrong takeaway is to freak out and say, hey, nobody should ever use a laxative because it's going to cause constipation, or right. it's going to cause dementia. Excuse me. If your laxative is causing constipation,
you've got problems.
Yeah.
Paradoxical laxative.
Yeah, there we go. Now, I think if you have some of those patients, and, I've run into a couple who are on, daily high dose laxatives for whatever reason, and let's say they've been on them chronically for years, well, now maybe that's a little bit of a different discussion. However, you still have to, weigh the risks and benefits of, okay, well, what happens if they don't poop, right? Do they get significant blockage that sends them to the ER? And again, we don't know if these findings will be consistent on repeat studies. I think it's an interesting, thought-provoking, sort of hypothesis-generating study, but I don't think we're at the point yet where we can run clinically and just tell everyone who's using a laxative to stop it. I think maybe you may change your approach to wanting to do bulk laxatives first, as opposed to just throwing everyone on, like, let's say, lactulose.
Right. I think that's fair.
Approach. I think that's fair.
Yeah, but especially if you've got a high genetic risk, like family history, that it would make sense. Oh, you've got constipation and you got high risk. Let's make sure you're on a bulk forming laxative as opposed to other forms. I think that makes sense.
And to my knowledge too, we can't kind of, one thing that we would have to take into consideration too, if we're doing from a clinical standpoint, is now we're going to have to screen large populations, large amount of people, and assess their genetic susceptibility for their baseline risk of dementia to begin with. And we're just not there yet.
That's true too. And also, if their hypothesis is correct that this is just a severity thing, then it doesn't make any sense to make sure that they're on bulk forming laxatives, because actually the issue is how severe the constipation is, nothing to do with the laxatives. Right. So, I mean, that's a challenge. It's like, it is confusing. So if you're listening and you're a bit confused, it's like saying, okay, if you did a study of everyone taking antidepressants and measured how many people were depressed versus people that didn't take antidepressants, there would be a strong association between taking antidepressants and being depressed. But it's not the antidepressants causing the depression. They're taking the antidepressants because they're depressed, right? B causes A, not A causes B. And that's the issue fundamentally with observational studies. And I think that's what we're running into now. We're not suggesting that, and the authors aren't suggesting that laxatives cause dementia. They were actually asking the reverse question. And I think what is safe to say, and they don't really talk about this, is like, what if there is a risk of constipation, if there's association with constipation and dementia, and we're still seeing it when you're taking laxatives, is that risk lower? Like, I didn't see that. Like, maybe it's still there but lower. I don't know what the baseline risk of people that are constipated.
It's even kind of like with lipid lowering therapies, right? In cardiovascular disease, we have a lot of therapeutic agents to lower your cholesterol, but it's really only statins and PCSK9 inhibitors, maybe ezetimibe, when you add it to statin therapy, that actually reduce the risk of cardiovascular outcomes. If you were to throw, niacin at someone, you're not going to get those, primary, or not primary, but you're not going to get those clinical outcomes that you want in preventing a heart attack or a stroke based on the literature that's available, right? So we have interventions that will lower your cholesterol, but which interventions are actually preventing the clinical outcome of a heart attack or a stroke? And so you can kind of apply that to this as well. And same thing with diabetes, right? We have really just two classes of medications that can prevent heart attack and stroke, because diabetes significantly increases that risk factor. But we have a ton of medications for diabetes, of which really only SGLT2 inhibitors and GLP-1 agonists actually have data to support the fact that we're preventing heart attacks and strokes with those agents, but not necessarily sulfonylureas.
So just to play that argument out, I think I'm tracking with you, is basically saying, in this case, if constipation was directly causal to dementia, then if we treat constipation, aka laxative, do we see a drop in dementia? So it's possible that we're not seeing that because it's not a large enough effect, and that, I think, is the examples that you're giving. Yeah, it lowers the constipation, it lowers the lipid levels, but doesn't lead to the outcomes that matter. Or there's some commonality. So there's some common cause that's both causing dementia and constipation, and by treating the constipation, it has zero effect on the common cause and therefore the dementia. We just don't know.
Yeah. And I mean, I think it's interesting too, if we think about like the bulk laxatives, if those aren't working, but they're also, based on this study, the only one that's not associated with dementia, is like, okay, do we need new therapeutic agents to treat constipation? Is constipation now a surrogate marker? if we want to kind of think it that way.
Right. That's the question, I think. I don't know. And I think their point about the severity really throws a wrench in our hypothesis about it being a surrogate, because if you're saying like, oh, that's working because of the fiber effects, whereas the other mechanisms don't impact the microbiome, and there you go, and there's the connection, gut-brain connection. That's one hypothesis. But if it's just a surrogate for severity, then it has zero impact whatsoever. We're just basically talking about, oh, it's just less severe constipation.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
So this, again, I think it's a great example. So thank you, SSL, for the study. And I think all the questions that we have really speak to the study design, in that because it's observational, we don't know what direction things are, and we don't know what's a surrogate for what versus what actually matters. But also, this is a great example of something that you can't study in a randomized trial in any meaningful way. And so this is what we're going to get. This is the best we're going to get. High quality, massive cohort, over decades, 500,000 people with genetic data. This is the best we're going to get, people, and we still are scratching our heads. So I think this really speaks to the limitations of observational studies in general. And you know what? We still have to make clinical decisions, and we have to treat the patient in front of us.
Yeah. Anyway, cool. Awesome. So how can people find out about us and learn more?
All right. So we are we're on all the socials, including, well, not yet, but I don't know if you heard. Did you hear that there's a new social media company?
Yeah, I was gonna bring that up. It actually looks really cool. So it's
signed up. Did you sign up?
I did. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. I was like, he's probably on it because he's an Insta guy, and it's like, I love how it was a Facebook company, but they didn't call it a Facebook app. They called it an Instagram app, because I think everyone has like negative feelings about it.
And it's not Facebook anymore. It's Meta.
And Meta, right? It's Meta. That's right. But they didn't call it a Meta app. They called it an Instagram app. Anyway. But yeah, it looks just like Twitter.
I like the format of it.
I like the format. It's cleaner.
Yeah.
I think they're totally taking it. Now the cage match between Musk and Zuckerberg makes more sense. I didn't realize that they were about to go head to head in the social media battles. But now this makes a lot more sense. So anyway, I signed up. Well, we should get Dr. Journal Club on there as well.
We will.
There's like nobody on it yet. Like just went live, like last night or something.
Yeah.
So anyway, but we're on Twitter. We're now on Threads. Is that what it's called? Threads?
It's called Threads. Yeah.
Threads. We're threading. We've threaded. It's unclear. It's unclear what the language use is yet at this point. But we're also on Facebook and Instagram and on YouTube. And so if you have any questions at all, you can also reach out to us, josh@drjournalclub.com, drjournalclub.com. Be like SSL. Be cool. Wear a bow tie. Play guitar in class. Change the world.
Ask us questions.
Oh, yeah. That's also why he's cool. That's where I was going with that. Ask us questions. If you have a study that you're curious about and you want to know our take, send it to us in an email, just like Cool SSL did, and we'll chat about it. And then SSL, if you're listening, if you have any follow-up questions, shoot us an email and we can address them. Any other listeners, if you have concerns, questions, hesitations, things you think we missed, bring them up in the next we can bring them up in an email and we can discuss it in the next pod. And that would kind of be cool too, to have some ongoing conversations about studies where we go really deep, as opposed to just sometimes just going very superficial about, here's the abstract, or here's the take-home clickbait results of the study. Because if you did the clickbait on this, you'd be like, oh my gosh, you got to stop using laxatives. That is not the take-home of this study.
And guys, if you want more of this on Dr. Journal Club, join it, because you will get big, meaty videos on a monthly basis of discussions like this, where we dive into the nitty-gritty of everything. And if you're like, Dr. Staszewski, I can't do that, I'm a busy clinician, we do 5-minute recaps of like what you truly need to know without it being clickbaity. We do 10-minute videos for those who have a little bit more time and want to kind of explore more. And then we have 15+ minute videos where we really kind of dive more into it. We explain the methodology. We talk a lot about the stuff that we get on the podcast to talk about. It's all clinical relevant. So join it. It's awesome. Be a member. Help us out.
Yeah, if you want to be cool, this is what all the cool kids are doing. And if you've got 10 seconds, we've got like key fact boxes. If you're in clinic and you can't do audio, we've got transcripts. Like you said, any way you want to consume this information, we've got it. We also have a video on propensity scoring, and so I'm going to link to that as well in the show notes. So yeah, thanks for listening. Check out drjournalclub.com, www.drjournalclub.com, and we'll see you next time.
Take care.
If you enjoy this podcast, chances are that one of your colleagues and friends probably would as well. Please do us a favor and let them know about the podcast. And if you have a little bit of extra time, even just a few seconds, if you could rate us and review us on Apple Podcast or any other distributor, it would be greatly appreciated. It would mean a lot to us and help get the word out to other people that would really enjoy our content. Thank you. Hey, y'all, this is Josh. We talked about some really interesting stuff today. I think one of the things we're going to do that's relevant, there is a course we have on Dr. Journal Club called the EBM Boot Camp that's really meant for clinicians to sort of help them understand how to critically evaluate the literature, et cetera, et cetera. Some of the things that we've been talking about today. Go ahead and check out the show notes link. We're going to link to it directly. I think it might be of interest. Don't forget to follow us on social and interact with us on social media. At Dr. Journal Club, Dr. Journal Club on Twitter. We're on Facebook, we're on LinkedIn, et cetera, et cetera. So please reach out to us. We always love to talk to our fans and our listeners. If you have any specific questions you'd like to ask us about research, evidence, being a clinician, et cetera, don't hesitate to ask. And then, of course, if you have any topics that you'd like us to cover on the pod, please let us know as well.
Thank you for listening to the Dr. Journal Club podcast, the show that goes under the hood of evidence-based integrative medicine. We review recent research articles, interview evidence-based medicine thought leaders, and discuss the challenges and opportunities of integrating evidence-based and integrative medicine. Be sure to visit www.drjournalclub.com to learn more.